Today on Living History, it's Michael Kahn-Ackermann.
We practically were not able to get in contact even with Chinese classmates. I later learned that our classmates also just took it for granted that we are spies. It's a kind of basic attitude which was extremely common. When I came to China, it was end of Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution was not yet finished. People were told every foreigner is suspect to be a spy.
Today on Living History, we're speaking with Michael Kahn-Ackermann. Michael studied sinology in Munich in the 1970s, and he was one of the very first West German students to arrive at Peking University in 1975. That was just after diplomatic relations between Germany and China had been re-established. This allowed him to witness China's dramatic transformation firsthand, experiences that he recounted in his memoir, China Within the Outer Gate. Michael was a founding director of the Goethe Institute in Beijing. He translated important works of Chinese literature, and he served as the China representative of the Stiftung Mercator, a private German foundation dedicated to promoting international understanding, education, and cultural exchanges. He has a well-earned reputation for creating space for genuine cultural exchanges, intellectual dialogue, and educational cooperation, and we are pleased to have him here today. Michael Kahn-Ackermann, welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I was really intrigued to learn that you had come to study at Peking University in 1975, because this was during the era of the worker peasant soldiers, the Gonglongbing, right? So the college entrance exam, the Gaokao, had not yet been reestablished. And I wonder, how was university life at Beida in those days compared to your experience studying in Munich?
This is the big question. A very fundamental difference, of course, and in a way, intriguing and shocking experience at the same time.
Shocking? Why?
I tell you, shocking in a very complicated way, not frightening, but it was my first encounter with a completely unknown, strange society, a country with completely strange and unknown people.
Why? You had studied sinology in Munich.
I had studied sinology, but sinology at that time in Germany was a kind of philology. At that time, sinology in Germany meant you read Chinese classics. You deal with classic Chinese philosophy, with history, with literature, but the contemporary China was completely out of focus in that time in the universities of Germany, and with a strange result that we could read the Lunyu of Confucius, but we couldn't read and understand Renmin Bao, the People's Daily, and we couldn't speak. We were also only trained in reading more or less classical texts. So when I came, we had all these German students. I was in the second group. The first group came in 1974, but as far as I remember, nobody stayed. They all left out of different reasons. But I think partly because they experienced the same kind of cultural shock we experienced, And so when I came to China, I couldn't speak Chinese. So we first had to go to Yuan Xueyan. This was a language training institution. Now today it's also a university. But at that time it was a kind of language school for foreigners mainly, and for Chinese learning foreign languages. So my first experience was not so much Beida. This was later in 1975. But this school, which was quite different because you had not so much contact with Chinese classmates. The Chinese you got to know were your teachers, and all these people who took care on you, which always were afraid that we looked on China with a kind of disappointment because China was so poor. In fact, for us, China was poor at the time, very poor. You cannot imagine how poor, partly. But this didn't bother us. It was not the problem of Chinese being poor or not underdeveloped or so. But it was this experience of being isolated and treated with political propaganda when we want to learn the language. Our language texts were articles from the People's Daily or other official Chinese media. So we also learned a very strange Chinese, not the Chinese which people normally speak so much, but this kind of official Chinese. And we found out that there was an atmosphere of fear, of distrust between people, not only between the Chinese and us, but also in between the Chinese groups. And that we were told lies the whole day long, what we learned in classroom, what we learned when we went outside to excursions to kindergartens or factories or people's communes or something like that. It was a kind of telling us stories which didn't fit at all about what we saw and what we felt. It was quite contrary to our feelings. So this was part of the shock, But I would like to read you a text which describes my first evening arriving in Beijing. At the entrance door or the main door of Yuanxuyan, of our school, standing in front of the door, looking on the streets in Wudao-kou, which was a quite still countryside-like part of Beijing at that time. Today, it's a center of Chinese high-tech.
Chinese cyclists. On the very day of my arrival, I felt drawn to them, standing by the roadside for a long time just to watch them. The stream of cyclists floats ceaselessly onward, purposeful yet calm, more propelled than driven by the leisurely push of pedals. The entire street was filled with this rhythm. It seemed to search with a motion both powerful and gentle. I marveled at the focused ease of his movement. All my feelings of foreignness seemed gathered within it, yet also a deep sense of comfort. I encountered them everywhere, in the crowded streets of Shanghai, at work in the rice fields, in the factories.
This was also a kind of shock, a very soft one. Of course, I was not really prepared to see all these small houses, rotten down apartment blocks, these kind of markets where people were not really happy to sell something to you because they had to do other things, and so on and so on. But my first experience was a kind of a different time and of a different behavior towards time, which is lost today in China. It's really the rhythm of this flow of bicycles, more or less exactly the life rhythm of the whole country. It was, of course, slower, but it was a kind of non-aggressive.
Yeah, it sounded like you were talking about harmonious traffic, which, given how chaotic traffic these days sometimes can be,
exactly.
Sounds like a different country.
Completely changed. The rhythm of life has changed completely. But at that time, people had a completely different understanding what time means. And they had time for everything. We always had time to sit down, to drink a cup of tea, to talk. They never had this kind of aggressive busyness which you meet today.
You were just saying that China was poor and that they were worried about it. So we nowadays see time as a luxury.
Exactly.
They were not aware of that.
No, because a very simple and a very simple reason: money didn't play a role. Money didn't help. What helped was guanxi. This was important, and a good relationship with your danwei, with your unit. Money was unimportant. Nobody cared about money. Though this is a good situation not to care about time. Underlying these very harmonious and soft-looking rhythm of life, it was a lot of political tension, of mutual distrust, of lies, of repression. But my first impression was exactly what I described when I first saw this flow of bicycles on Beijing streets.
I want to ask you specifically about the distrust and isolation that you were just talking about. Because when you arrived and you met, for instance, at Beida, the Gongnongbing, the worker peasant soldiers, they had just emerged from a period that was extremely tumultuous, where a lot of them had learned, don't trust anyone with your real feelings. Don't tell anybody, because people got criticized. People got beaten, for not being sufficiently politically aligned. How did they treat you? Because you're the ultimate outsider at that point.
In the first year in the language school, we practically were not able to get in contact even with Chinese classmates. We met in the classroom, but they didn't want to get into contact, or they didn't dare to build up a kind of personal contact with us, because that would lead to questions. What about what you have spoken with this foreigner? Yeah, be careful when you talk with foreigners, and so on and so on. And I later learned that our classmates also just took it for granted that we are spies.
Took it for granted that you were spies.
Yes. Yeah.
How did you find that out?
Later.
Tell me.
They laughed when they told me afterwards, in the early 80s, when I came back to this is the kind of it's a kind of basic attitude which was extremely common in when I came to China. It was end of Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution was not yet finished, and people were told every foreigner is suspect to be a spy. So very naturally, they were very cautious not to have a real contact with us. And we had the privilege, I have to say, I don't know whose ideas it was, but it was a really privilege that we had one room in our dormitory, for two people, us and our Chinese roommates, which of course were taught to control us too, to be very friendly, helpful, and they were very friendly and helpful, but of course also to control us. And they had to write reports about our behavior and what they knew from us every week. Once a week they had to write a report. And my roommate in Beida did it, of course. He had to do it. He had to do it. But after a while, he really got bored, because what should he report every week? So he told me, and we decided we write these reports together.
That's amazing.
It was helpful for him because I could tell him what he should write, But of course, this took a lot of time. We really had to know each other much better. And Xiao Du, my roommate, became a friend. We did a lot of things together. But for example, but when I left Beida and he left Beida because he was Gunung Bing Xueyan and he had to leave in 77, we lost contact because he was a soldier and couldn't be in contact with a foreigner, But these kind of distrust or foreigners are possibly spies is still alive in a way and can be very easily revitalized by official propaganda. And that's what we experience at the moment, that people were told, be aware, foreigners could be spies. And when we founded the Goethe Institute for the Chinese officials and bureaucracy, it was not a question, but it was a fact that Goethe Institute is an intelligence institute.
You were at Beida. I had talked to Jaime Florcruz, who was talking about how lonely he sometimes was as a 20-something-year-old man in China, unable to find a girlfriend, unable to date. You were also talking about the difficulty of having real friendships and relationships. What was it like for you?
It was, I have to say, he came already in very early, much earlier than us. He came as an asking for asylum, for political asylum. He was a refugee. He came when I remember
1971.
In 1971, which was, of course, much harder. I came in 75. It was already, the furor of cultural revolution already was gone. The atmosphere was more dull than revolutionary, He probably was very isolated because not only he had no possibility, we didn't have neither, to date a Chinese girlfriend, of course not. That would be a catastrophe for the girlfriend and for us too, because I would be immediately exposed, But
you think you would have been expelled?
Yeah, I would, for sure. I would be expelled immediately and the girl could go to jail.
You just mentioned loneliness. And that really struck me in your book, because you were a 20-something-year-old boy, and you wrote, as foreigners, we were not allowed to socialize. How does a 20-something-year-old deal with such loneliness in a new country?
It was very difficult. It was, I think, aside from any physical pain, it was the pain of being lonely and being homesick that was hard to bear. A 20-year-old born and bred in the Philippines, where we enjoyed freedom to speak, but also freedom to do what young people did. And then missing out on what the family was doing, missing friends. That was very difficult because it's like being plunked in a place where the culture was very different, especially at that time. And China was still in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, and there were many taboos, ideologically, politically driven taboos that made it at least very different, if not alien, for somebody like me who grew up in the Philippines at a tender age.
But he was still more isolated because he had no foreign co-students.
Yeah.
We at least had all these other German or other European student friends. whom we could talk about our experiences and share our impressions and discuss our problems.
And he volunteered, but he was still sent down to the countryside. You guys just went for a little bit.
We went to the countryside. We went 3 weeks. Yeah, this was obligatory not only for us but for every student. For this Gungnung Bing Xueyan at that time in Beida, it was completely awkward because they came from the countryside, so they didn't like at all to go back only for a week or so. For them, it was so boring, and it was sending them back to somebody which it just happily left. For us, it was an adventure, and we loved it. And I have to say, the most fruitful experience I made during these 2 years in Chinese universities was not so much classroom. Classroom was full with nonsense, because they had to tell you nonsense. But the experience living in a house of a peasant, to get in contact with this peasant family, to find out what really Chinese countryside life means. Worked on the fields, and we loved it to do these physical works, completely contrary to our Chinese classmates who hated it and tried to use us, saying to these officials, they are foreigners, they are not accustomed to hard work, and so we should have more pauses and more relaxing time. And we said, no, we want to work, and it was really, they hated us for that, I learned more about China in these 3 weeks than in the month before in university, I mean, I learned both sides of China, the official one and the real one. And the official, of course, is part of the reality, but there is another real China which has not so much to do with the official one.
That is actually leading me to a question that I've been meaning to ask you anyway. How does a college student from Munich in those days even get to China? Because that also must have seemed impossible to overcome.
I have to say, the so-called academic exchange between Germany and, I have to say, other Western European countries started already in 1974. This institution who organized this kind of academic exchange in Germany is called DAAD, and they could send a small number of students to Chinese universities. We were a group of 11 persons. You had to go a kind of examen to apply. You could apply for that, especially people who had a basic understanding on Chinese. So I applied for the second one and were refused because I belonged to these kind of revolutionary students who opposed this kind of only dealing with China, with the historical China. We asked for contemporary China studies. And this of course, the professors very much disliked us. Yeah. And when I first applied, I was refused.
How did your professors feel about contemporary China in those days?
It was under their level. For them, it was not a kind which a good academic and trained academic should deal with. He should deal with Sung times philosophy and.
So they were kind of snooty about it, 看不起.
Yeah, absolutely. Huh. I tell you a very funny situation which makes it clear. In 1976, the first group of German professors of China studies or of sinology came to China after Cultural Revolution. And they came to Beida, and we German students, of course, were at Beida. We were asked to be present because it was all our professors, and we had to be obedient students and respectfully sit to their knees. and listen to master's voice. So they came, and the director of Beida received them and had some other experts with him, Chinese experts on Europe or I don't know what. And they were not prepared to bring with them interpreters. Because, of course, they thought they are all famous sinologists, so language is not a problem.
But
it turned out to be an enormous problem. And so head of Beida had his speech and said, I want it to be shortly because I know you are all experts, so let us start to talk with each other. Silence. Nobody opened the mouth because they couldn't speak Chinese.
That's incredible.
And then the only one who spoke a very good and fluent Chinese, because before the war he has been in China a long time, Professor Franke from Munich too, one of my professors. He felt the situation too awkward, and he started to speak. And he spoke and spoke and spoke, but at a certain point he had to stop. Again, silence. You know?
That is damning.
And then I really appreciate very much my professors, Professor Bauer from Munich, courage. He said, I understand this is awkward now, but you have to understand we are dealing with classic Chinese and we cannot speak contemporary Chinese.
Yes.
This I found really good, a good explanation, and all people got relieved. And then one of our classmates started to act as interpreter.
You know, this is actually something very important. You have to be comfortable asking for help sometimes.
Yeah, and that he, in the eyes of the Chinese, very important, very respectable academic, that didn't dare to say, I cannot speak Chinese, excuse me, because this is loss of faith.
How was it for you? Because you had studied sinology and you arrived here. Did you ask for help?
Of course.
Did you have problems, or how did you solve it?
I had a lot of problems because I couldn't speak. I couldn't speak Chinese. I could read Chinese, but I couldn't speak Chinese. We were they started that time to teach a little to speak, but it was not important part of my studies, And in Germany, in Munich, sitting at Leopoldstraße, trying to speak Chinese with nobody because you could speak with nobody, was a rather hopeless undertaking,
Okay, tell me a little bit about the actual journey that you took to come here. I'm going to assume there was no direct flight on Lufthansa like today.
It was I don't know which airline we flew. We flew to Karachi. In Karachi, we had a stop, and then we flew from Karachi to Beijing, to the old airport, which still exists. And now is the airport for the big shots, for the
state visitors, the terminal.
And then we were immediately brought to this language school, Yuan Xueyang. So, and it was where my first evening I stayed at the entrance gate of the school, looking on the bicycles on the street.
And at that time, China was still a very isolated country, which also means that you were probably the first foreign face that a lot of people saw. You'd show me a picture in a village where people were looking at you. What were the kind of questions people would ask you?
They wouldn't ask questions. They didn't dare to ask questions, you know. Nobody did dare to approach you directly. And if you went to somebody, for example, asking something, where should I go or so, they were really scared. You know, such a kind of reaction. For example, when we went to buy things in these strange shops, they not only were busy with other things, but they don't want to speak with you. They were afraid. They thought, how can I speak with such a person? You know, we could buy bicycles because we had a huge salary. You know, not only the scholarship, the German scholarship, which was a lot of money for the time, but because the Chinese had to do everything. The Chinese government had to do everything and vice versa. So the Chinese students in Germany got a German scholarship, which was not big, but it was enough to live on. And I don't know how many hundred D-mark. So the Chinese had to give us a quite similar salary, which was incredibly, we got 120 yuan a month, which probably was more than the Prime Minister of China got in the, you know. And the problem was only we couldn't spend that money. Money was not important. I mean, for everything of importance, you had to have this kind of coupons of
FEC.
No. FEC is much later. No, you have to have, you got, like in Germany after the war, you got this kind of distribution.
Oh, you mean ration coupons?
Yeah, coupons. You know.
I didn't know that FEC was later.
No, much later. We got these coupons so we could buy vegetables or something to eat or something like that. And coupons to buy a bicycle, which for Chinese was somebody who buys his first car. And for us, it was no problem at all. We could, you have to have these coupons and you have to pay money. And for Chinese, both was difficult to get the coupon and to have enough money to buy this bicycle. In all their life, as I said, money didn't play a really important role, you know. So we had bicycles, so we went outside. We went through Beijing to the city, and we went everywhere. So we, with a friend, with a German student, other German student, we went to the Ming tombs, which was that time. Now you have a highway there, but at that time it was a very small streets, and you got lost after a while. So we went there and didn't know how to go further. So I saw two peasants working in a field nearby, and I went to them, asking them, where is the way to the Ming tombs? Could you tell me how we should go to the Ming tombs? And he looked at me a little scared, no answer at all. And I asked again, no reaction at all. So I gave it up, you know. Turning around, I heard that he said to his neighbor, the other peasant, these foreigners strange. It was like he was asking where to go to the Ming tombs. You know, that was what he thought he understood, but it couldn't be that he understood what I was asking. It was impossible that these strange, long-nosed people can ask me understandable how to go to the Ming tombs, you know. We had the privilege we could travel. The foreign students in China could travel where every foreigner has to ask the foreign office or the people who were in charge of him. We as foreign students could leave Beijing, we could travel. So we decided to travel to Datung. Datung is about 300 kilometers from Beijing, and it has these incredible Yungang caves. So we came to Datung, staying in a hotel. And immediately by the hotel manager, we were asked not to leave the hotel because it could create problems. He didn't specify what kind of problems we would have, but it was very clear we shouldn't leave the hotel. Of course, we didn't listen to him, but went out. Going through this old Datum, which is completely torn down now. And after a while, we had a very strange feeling, a kind of rumor behind, like a wave of the sea or something like that, a kind of very strange rumor. And we turned around and we saw a crowd of about 5,000 people behind of us in a secure distance, about 30 or 40 meters, following us. And when we turned around, the people in the first row react with a kind of, become afraid and stopped. And the people behind pushed them forward. So it was like a wave of the sea going there and back,
5,000 people?
Yes, because these people never in their life had seen foreigners.
What happened next?
Next happened that we understood why the manager didn't want that we get out. So we probably shortened our walk and went back to the hotel, because it was not because we were afraid, but it was a completely surrealistic situation,
So I have to ask you a little bit more about that, because in the beginning you just now said you could travel in China, but many cities in China, many places in China, provinces, were closed to foreigners by default, unless you had a permit. Are you saying because your Danwei was Beida, you were allowed to travel?
All foreign students enrolled in Chinese universities were allowed during holidays, of course, not during classes, were allowed to freely travel in China, except, of course, regions which have been out of bound, as today still exist. I couldn't go to Tibet, or I probably couldn't go to Yunnan, or I don't know.
Well, Yunnan is open.
Today, everything is open. That time, there were some regions more than now, which were for foreigners out of bound. But principally, we could go everywhere. And of course, we used this privilege, and we had so much money, though. Going by train was not a problem for us. Staying in a hotel was not a problem for us. And I mean, the experience of these thousands of people following us in Datum was extreme. But of course, people staring at us and creating small crowds, or followed us from a certain distance. This you get accustomed. It was just normal, Much less already in that time in Shanghai, for example.
I was going to ask you, when did you start seeing the situation regarding China being so isolated and closed change?
This is a process. It's not at a certain time that changed. When I came back in 1983 to Shanghai, people still looked at me as something unusual or strange, but people, especially young people, approached me because they wanted to speak English with me, It was the only reason why they want to talk with me. They were not curious about what I'm doing here or what I live. They want just to train their English.
They were not curious what you were doing here.
Probably they were curious, but they didn't ask. They didn't dare to ask, or they were not accustomed to ask so private things. The main purpose was to get in contact with somebody with whom they could train their English.
Why were they interested in practicing English with you when just a few years before they were afraid of even talking to you?
No, it was already, I mean, you have in 83, the politics of opening and reform already had begun, and Shanghai was always a little more open than, for example, Beijing or smaller Chinese cities, or not to speak about countryside. And it was difficult, but you could get into a personal contact with Chinese people. You could have been invited even into their houses. Also, it was for them very complicated because you first had to inform the Danwei. I want to invite a foreigner into my house. You had to apply. He had to explain why and who he is, and so on and so on. And so we did it very, we were very hesitant to do it because we knew that for our friends, it was a kind of, it created complications. And they were also asked afterwards about what way have you speaking, what can you tell me about this person or so, you know. But it was much more open than in 75 or 76.
Yeah. Because you just mentioned complications, I was very surprised to hear that when you became interested in translating contemporary Chinese authors, Liao Weiwo was one example that I'm thinking of, that you could not get interest from publishers or university professors in Germany and other places. I'm really surprised by that. Why?
I became interested in Chinese literature also in the early 80s because the early 80s were a very interesting time. It was like seeing people awaking from a kind of nightmare. Cultural Revolution was over, but of course in the minds of the people, it was not finished in 76. And you could talk with people, also privately, but only on certain, not to politics, not to history related topics, you know. And I started to become interested in contemporary Chinese literature because after 76, 77 started a kind of literature genre called scar literature.
Scar
wounds, yeah, scar literature, where people wrote about their experiences during Cultural Revolution and in the years where they're sent on the countryside and so on. It was from literature. Most of these literature had no real literary value. It was very sentimental, very stereotyped, but it was really something where people first time showed their wounds, you know, showed their scars, showed what they have experienced.
It reminds me of outsider art.
Yeah. It was, it was a kind of, and people, for example, started to write about love, which was completely impossible in the during Cultural Revolution. This was bourgeois, counter-revolutionary, and so on. They started to write love stories. They started to describe conflicts between Red Guardists and so on, very carefully, very symbolically. But this made me, I was interested in that kind of literature because it deepened this impression that the whole Chinese population is like a person slowly awaking from a nightmare to reality.
You're characterizing it as a nightmare, But at the same time, we see until today Mao Zedong also being seen as a hero of China. How do you balance this dichotomy? Like, people seem to have conflicting feelings here in China. I'm not talking about foreigners. I'm talking about Chinese people. How were these feelings balanced at that time?
People had no real orientation. For example, during our time at university, we had to take part in these endless demonstrations. Each time when something happened, the meeting of the People's Congress also, there were these kind of organized demonstrations where people have to
wave flags
and so on, and to cry slogans. And when we came to China in 1975, it was already a complete ritualized thing. People were really bored. And when coming to Tiananmen, they started to get upright and to cry and to call their slogans, And afterwards, they went back in this kind of bored walking. The first really emotional demonstration I saw was when the Gang of Seven was brought down. People really had a feeling of being freed. I don't think it was so much politically, because people didn't know much more about politics than we knew. I mean, they had rumors, they had and so on, but they were not really informed people what's going on. But of course, they felt this kind of pressure in their all-day life. One thing is to be poor and to look that you have enough to eat. The second one, all around control from unit of police, of everyone, and of neighbors. And there were some people already saw these developments as a political change, young intellectual students. And you had the wall of democracy in 78. And this started at that time, but it was not, but the main feeling was, we can breathe again. And this developed in the 80s very strongly. And this car literature was the first beginning of remembering what has happened in the last 20 years, what I have done, what I have suffered, what I have experienced. They had no literary means to tell it very refined or so, but they talked about. A very rarely asked question is, how could the Communist Party, as a ruling party, survive the end of Cultural Revolution? The country was completely run down. Industry, agriculture, everything. Practically no real development for about 10, 15 years. A lot of us came as people awaiting a kind of incredible social experiment.
Uh-huh.
And we had we perceived Cultural Revolution as a successful revolution. Our revolution, students' revolution in 68, failed.
So you thought this was a utopia when you came here?
I never was a real Maoist. But of course, I was a leftist student. Mm-hmm. And I expected a very exciting, vibrant social movement in China, which successfully realized things which we thought should be, for example, this kind of open education, criticizing the established power people and so on. When we came, and this was why I said I was shocked, it was not at all, in no way, that kind of utopia we expected. There were a lot of Maoists under the Western European students who really became completely pissed off, and said, I will never go back to China,
That's so interesting. They were pissed off at what?
This experiencing that this country was not the China they expected. They dreamed of,
But were they disillusioned with the idea, or were they blaming the execution of the idea?
How much they were delusioned with I think both probably happened. Some people were delusioned with the idea and they left all their leftist utopia at all. Some of them just said, this is not what we want. This is not what we expected.
Okay.
And this is all because if you are every day confronted with people telling you blank lies about Chinese reality, how great it is and how harmonious it is and how people love each other and what the state is all doing for people and so on. And of course, we were not stupid. We saw that this doesn't fit to reality. And but we also saw that people have to talk like this, And one of my first experiences with China, basic experience, was the fact that Chinese can live in two realities. When they had to speak publicly, that spoke completely different from what they were speaking privately. But they didn't have the impression when they talked this public stuff, where they knew that is bullshit. They didn't have the feeling they were lying. It was just another reality. It is the official reality and it is a real reality. And you have to live in both,
Your public face and your private face.
Yeah, your public face, your private face, your public speaking, your private speaking, your public behavior, your private behavior. And I was really puzzled because I thought these people must be schizophrenic, become schizophrenic, But they didn't. For them, it was okay. You have to respect, there are two different realities. And both of them are real.
Your book actually really intrigues me because I was both using Baidu, the Chinese internet, and I was also using the Chinese AI search engine, DeepSeek, and asked it about the contents of your book.
Yeah.
And the answer was, this is outside of my scope. Let's talk about something else.
Of course. I tell you about the how this book was written. I was addressed by, when I came back to Germany, I decided not to continue to work and to do my sinologist studies because I had the feeling all these studies has nothing to do with the real China. So I had different jobs. I worked as a journalist. I made lectures on my experience in China and so on. And I was approached by the Bavarian Broadcasting Company if I would do a series of lectures on my experiences with China. And so I did. And I was really surprised about the reaction. The reaction was very strong. The reaction was very surprisingly because I did these lectures, and then this very little publishing company, asked me if they could use my manuscripts and make a book out of it. And I said, yeah, of course, I have it here. Here it is. But I never expected a real interest, a public interest, because I thought this is so strange for people. I mean, who would be interested in that, what I am telling? But to my surprise, it had a huge impact in Germany. And all newspapers wrote articles about the book, and for them it was a kind of eye-opener. We first see the real China, which of course was very flattering. And the problem only was this completely unexperienced publishing company forgot to ask for an ISBN number, which is essential for a bookstore
To order the book.
to order the book. So nobody could order the book. When it was discussed really everywhere, such a heap of critics and more or less enthusiastic articles on this book. So I lost the chance to become rich with the book.
It sounds a little bit like people were treating your exploration of China like they would treat a David Attenborough nature documentary.
In a way, yeah, because it was so. I mean, it was not the first book about contemporary China. I mean, there have been correspondents there, and they wrote books, but what they described was a very general China the political system, the economic system, and so on and so on. Not really, because these people couldn't have this kind of all-day experience we as students had. And I was not aware, but what I described as very personal experience was for these people looking in a mysterious country which became open in a way, very small window. China is one of these mystical countries. Everyone has his personal utopia or his personal mystification of this country. And in the early 80s, I would say most of Germans thought Chinese still have these long tails. And what happened in 1989 was in a kind of logical consequence of what happened in the 80s.
Were you here in 89?
I was not only here, I was at Zhangjiajie.
Tell me how you experienced that personally.
First time saw people dying.
Tell me about that day.
Oh, how to say? I mean, it was a very excited atmosphere all the time, you know. And of course, we, out of curiosity, went to Tiananmen, and I knew one of the leaders of the movement. Talked to them, finding out that I would, the imagination they would become leaders of this country was a kind of horror, because they were, in a way, fascists, you know. Didn't understand what means democracy at all. Democracy is, my opinion, becomes the dominating opinion, you know. They were very dogmatic in their way, you know.
They were college students.
They were college students, yeah, and they had all kind of dreams of the one hand they were against corruption, which was rampant already in the time. This was clear, and this was why they had the sympathy of the general population. And of course, all my heart was with them, and I couldn't imagine that the party leadership really would use the army to suppress it. And I only later understood that it was not so much, it had not been necessary. The intelligent police action would have solved the problem too. But the party had to mobilize the army. Otherwise, it was not quite clear on which side the army would be.
Do you think that was calculated, or was it a screw-up?
Both. But I would say that it was an inner party struggle, a very strong inner party struggle. And as always in the history of Chinese Communist Party, power is coming out of the guns. So Deng Xiaoping wanted to be sure that the army will stay with him or with his part of the party. So he ordered to mobilize the army. Because after 89, the army could not follow him.
What did you do that day?
I talked to people. Afterwards, I helped some of them as far as I could to get out of the country or so.
You helped people get out of the country?
Yeah, as far as I could. We had the probably intellectually most interesting staff at that time at Goethe Institute, because a lot of people couldn't find work anymore because they were expelled from their working place and had nothing to do, nothing to work. I invited them to work in our library.
What did the Goethe Institute do in those days anyway? What was the mission?
One thing was we hang out a huge German flag at the front of the Goethe Institute to show that we are extraterritorial in a way. Of course, we were not, but we fought desperately to stay, because there was a discussion, ongoing discussion also in Germany, we should close the Goethe Institute. And I was completely opposed. I said, this would help exactly not the people you want to help, you know? And this would close a door which we never can open again. And at the end, we succeeded. It was a very tense time. You were controlled every time when I go back from the Goethe Institute. But of course, I never had personal problems. When I joined the Goethe Institute as an institution, my dream was I will become the first director of the Goethe Institute in Beijing. It was a dream like I would to become the first Goethe Institute director on the moon. The main problem was that there is a decision of the Chinese Central Committee in the 50s that there should not exist any foreign cultural or educational institution in China. This had to do with experience with these missionary schools and all this stuff. Part of this half colonialism of Western powers in China was establishing these kind of extraterritorial Chinese cultural and educational institutions. So when Helmut Kohl came first time to China, he met Deng Xiaoping, and of course they had their protocol. What about they had to talk. And after they finished their protocol, Helmut Kohl said, we would like to open a Goethe Institute in China. And Deng Xiaoping, who of course didn't have no idea what this Goethe Institute should be, but Goethe is something nice, said, why not? And opened it to further talks. I worked in Tongji University at the time, in this training Chinese students for preparing for studies in Germany. Came 3 people from the foreign ministry to me, to Shanghai, asking me, please tell us what is the Goethe Institute?
So the Chinese foreign ministry.
Yeah, you know? And I said, yeah, it's an institution for cultural exchange and teaching German in foreign countries. They were frightened to death.
Why?
Because it was forbidden. It was explicitly forbidden. No cultural or educational foreign institution on Chinese soil, on Chinese within China. And now Deng Xiaoping had said, why not? So what to do? And the best way is just to do nothing.
Uh-huh.
So it was just silence. Kohl came back in 96 or 97, I don't remember exactly. Had another talk with Deng Xiaoping, which was much more in power at that time already. Kohl asked, so what is with our Goethe Institute? And Deng Xiaoping, which of course still had no idea what Goethe Institute is, said, so what? And Kohl said, I have heard nothing about. And Deng Xiaoping obviously played his role as to being very upset and called his secretary, I don't know whom, and said, do it. So now they had no chance anymore. And it began another game. Who is responsible for this fucking Goethe Institute? Nobody, no ministry wanted to be responsible for that. Because for them it was quite clear this is a spy organization, undercover. They talk about culture, but they are spies. In the end, the responsibility fell to the Educational Commission. It was not a ministry. The commission was lower in ranking as a ministry because they were weak and they couldn't refuse at the end. But it had certain consequences. The Educational Commission was responsible for teaching and learning, but not for culture. So one part of the contract creating the Goethe Institute was that we were not allowed to do any kind of cultural programs, but only programs in respect of teaching and learning German. This was one condition from the Chinese side. And the other one, it has to have a Chinese co-director, which never has happened in the history of the Goethe Institute, that it's a purely German institution and abroad. And the director and the co-director, of course, are Germans and so on. So that it took a lot of time. The first draft were refused by the German side. The second draft was refused by the Chinese side. And in the beginning of '88, they signed it. One of the reasons why the German side refused was this Chinese co-director. And then the Goethe Institute told me, you will be the founding director, prepare. And so they asked me, what do you think about this Chinese co-director? And I said, fine, great, I need him. He could be very helpful. And after all, with big stomach ache, they accepted the Chinese co-director. And it, of course, turned out it was a good thing. He helped me a lot. The Goethe Institute was 16 years the only foreign institution of that kind, cultural, educational, in China. Mm. And only in 2004, the Alliance Française, was allowed to work in China, and they had a kind of French Cultural Institute. So for the Chinese, it was a real, very important and a very difficult, because this decision of the 50s never was dismissed, was still valid, you know. Sure. And only Deng Xiaoping could say, I don't care about that, you know. The most important part of the Goethe Institute was the library. Why? Because it was for the artistic and intellectual elite of Beijing and even of other parts of China. It had the function of a window into this mystical West. You can imagine, no internet, no books. People couldn't get books. Yeah, and if they went to their libraries in the universities, they were only allowed to read books which we are allowed to read. So what we, from the beginning on, did, we bought everything which has something to do with Germany. Bought in Taiwan, bought in Hong Kong, bought in China, and built up a huge library. And the second thing was, and this has now to do already with exhibitions, we bought tons of catalogs and art books and books on architecture. This was our contribution to the development of Chinese contemporary art. And we found it out because one day the head of the library came to me complaining that people tore pages of the catalogs and of the art books and taking them with them. And what shall we do? These are very expensive books. I cannot buy so many of them, you know. And I said, it's great, it's great. It shows that they can use it. And I would say practically nobody of the intellectual, artistic elite of Beijing hasn't been in that library, because it was the only place where you had access to this kind of information. But the Chinese staff of the library was obliged to work for the security ministry, and we knew it. My secretary also was working for them.
When did this nervousness on the part of Chinese authorities towards foreigners change? When did things get more relaxed?
Okay, let me take the example of the Goethe Institute. All of a sudden, in 1993, there are these regulatory cultural agreements between countries, also between Germany and China, and they have to be renewed every 5 years. So in 1993, we had these negotiations on the new cultural agreement. And all of a sudden, China accepted that the Goethe Institute could do cultural programming. Everyone was surprised, me too. The German foreign policy didn't understand what the founding of the Goethe Institute meant and why it was so difficult for the Chinese side to accept it. And that it was a real historical breakthrough that they allowed a foreign cultural institute in China. Yeah, they didn't realize that, I have to say. Okay, so we were enthusiastic creating programs and had a huge program for 93-94. I asked another very famous, international famous German artist, Günter Uecker. He is famous for his work with nails. I don't know it. Yeah. I met him in Düsseldorf. He's working in Düsseldorf, and asked him if he would help me to have an exhibition of his artwork in China. And he said, yes, but I have under one condition: you have to go with me to Tibet.
Wow! And
we had a wonderful, wonderful journey through Tibet. And then he made a special work called Letter to Beijing for this exhibition. And we already looking desperately for a space to show it, because still no museum would ever have been built. And all out of a sudden, the that time responsible ministry informed me that it was forbidden to do any cultural event. Boom.
Why?
Why? I didn't understand. Of course not, you know. But anyway, what can you do? So we gave it all up. And later, I only found out why. Because in 93, Jiang Zemin that time already president of China, went to France. And Mitterrand, they talked about what they had to talk about, what was on the agenda. And afterwards he said, Mr. President, we would like to open a French cultural center in Beijing. And Jiang Zemin answered, Mr. President, I have to inform you, we have a general politic decided by the Central Committee, no foreign cultural institution in China. And Mitterrand said, we just want something like the Goethe Institute. And Jiang Zemin, who definitely didn't know what the Goethe Institute is, came back to the embassy furiously and said, what the fuck is this Goethe Institute? And they had, at that moment, a policy of fighting against the ideology of peaceful peaceful coexistence, and he decided the Goethe Institute is, I have to say it in Chinese, Heping Yanbian de Jinru Zhongguo de Maotou, the peak of the intrusion of foreign ideological propaganda for peaceful coexistence in China. They couldn't close the Goethe Institute because it was a written contract in between two governments. But in the contract was not foreseen that we could do cultural work, cultural exchange. So therefore we were forbidden to do anything like that. And as far as I know, this another change happened in '97 when we were allowed again to do cultural programming. And even the responsibility for our work changed from the Ministry of Education to the Ministry of Culture. Reasons I don't know, something opening to Germany, opening to Europe, I don't know.
From 1975 until now, that's 50 years that you have been involved with China. Looking back on that time, how do you feel about your experiences in the past, and how do you feel about the future?
I have to tell you something for my life very important for my life very important and influential experience. When I also was completely disappointed and disillusioned on China, as everyone in the group was. But I would say also partly this time on the countryside suddenly made me aware something which changed in a way my outlook on China and my outlook on myself. I suddenly thought, what the hell? Why you think China is made for you? China is not, it's not the obligation of China to be the realization of my utopia and of my dreams, you know. And I decided, it was a real decision, I give up all my dreams, all my visions, all my hopes, and just look, get a kind of, on the one hand, distance in behalf of China. I kept a kind of distance, but I didn't judge all the time. It was this idea of the good China and the bad China, the light, the China and the dark China, it doesn't, slowly vanished. And I became just in a way curious. And I have to say that helped me until now not to give up my basic values, how a society should function. It even didn't really change my political views. What was not so difficult because, as I said, I was never a really fiery Maoist. But it helped me a lot during very difficult times, and we had a lot of very difficult times. Of other disillusions, of course, 89 was a real big disillusion, another one. And I remember that a good friend of mine, a very famous Chinese writer, told me in 90 or 91, I don't know, he said, I know you're foreigners, you all think an utopia of China was smashed in 89. But I tell you, these people didn't understand anything about China. These young people that didn't realize, that didn't have no clue on Chinese reality. And of course, I was shocked and I was very angry, and but I found out it is, in a way, it was true.
But isn't that true for any young person?
No, of course not. But in a way, 89 renewed China as an utopian model, And I became, in a way, really, catched by this utopian hope. Fascinated, completely fascinated. And of course, even if I disliked the leaders of the movement, because they really were narcissistic and dogmatic people. On the other way around, I found the same thing in Russia, that the dissidents were a kind of mirroring the system in many ways, But of course, it was another Chinese dream. But it helped me to get a realistic view on a Chinese society back very quickly. That is not a kind of compromising but it is a kind of primarily to look and not to judge. This is a kind of basic attitude.
I understand that. How do you feel about the future?
This is very hard to say, because Chinese is such a complex society that I don't think anyone can tell you how China will be in 30 or 40 years. There can be a war. There can be a real economic crisis. There can be a real superpower, having much more impact on the outer world than still now, where China is more or less only economic superpower. Every is possible. I tell you something which is, for me, very significant. When I came first to China, I had the experience of talking with people, still in the early 80s, talking with people, and all of a sudden, the person I spoke with changed to a very low voice. Also, I couldn't find anything dangerous or very critical or dissidential in the content what he was speaking. And interestingly, when I asked him, why do you lower your voice now? He said, what? I'm lowering my voice? He were not aware about, it was a kind of automatism, trained. What can you say openly and what you have to look around before you say it. And this was very normal in when I came first, but it still existed very much in the early 80s. And slowly it went away during 80s and 90s. And people had this kind of lowering the voice all out of a sudden, and being not aware that I'm lowering my voice practically vanished in these 20, 30 years. And it came back since about 10 years, more and more. And the same phenomenon, talking with people, and people all out of a sudden lowering their voice, saying something a little more critical than people in the early 80s, but really nothing which could them bring to jail. And when you ask them why, you find out they were not aware. I'm not romantic about the 80s. It's a lot of Chinese intellectuals, artists, and so on are very romantic about the 80s because it was a time of hope. It was always difficult, and really, freely speaking, was very seldom experienced. You could talk with friends and with people you know and people you trusted. You could speak quite freely in these years after, beginning from mid of the 80s until, 10 years ago. But what I found out, it's so easy to revitalize the patterns of people's behavior I encountered first when I came first time to China. It is very near under the skin. The years before opening and reform created a kind of cautiousness, of fear into the people. People themselves are not aware about it. And it's very easy to bring it out once again.